So we're going to spend the next 50 minutes together. The way we're going to proceed is that we'll have a first 20 minutes with the panelists. We'll have 5 minutes each. Then there will be a 20-minute question period where you can participate as well. And the last 10 minutes we'll keep for recommendations, because remember, we're meeting today, hopefully, to have some impact on the G7 that will be held in Quebec in La Malbaie. So this is how we're going to proceed. I will be fairly strict about the timing, but I'm sure that we'll have a very constructive meeting and discussion. So Monsieur Charest, he was my boss. He was the premier. And before I start talking about protectionism, I just want you to know that he was the first prime minister of a province who came up with a cabinet composed of 50% of women and 50% of men. Second, he was also the one who first decided, and by the way, the women around the table, we were quite surprised. He was the one who said that boards of organization of the government, so that you understand more or less, you know, they sort of belong to the government, they have to have boards composed of 50% of women. So that's another thing that he did. So we have in front of us a very strong feminist. Apart from being a partner at McCarthy in Montreal, you're the former Premier of Quebec. And perhaps, I don't know, Mr. Charest, what you want to address exactly, but I know one thing. You started to talk about CETA in the 26th of January 2007. And it was signed in 2017. It took 10 years to reach the agreement. Perhaps you could talk to us about that. Prends ton microphone.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Monique. And I do want to thank the Women's Forum for being here in Canada. And I have the great privilege of knowing about the Women's Forum from their European incarnation. And it has always had a very, very important influence in Europe, and in France in particular. So to be here for the first time on the eve of the G7 for us is a real compliment. Monique and I, full disclosure so that you know, we worked together in politics, and she was a minister in my government in 2003, and she led the battle in Quebec for pay equity and brought in major legislation, and was the Minister of Finance and Treasury Board. And I remember we used to be in cabinet. She, from time to time, would say to me, she'd sit on my left, she'd say, Premier, elle dit, là, je vais vous dire quelque chose que vous ne voulez pas entendre. And she'd say this a few times. After a while, I told her, you know, si je ne veux pas l'entendre, Monique, je ne sais pas pourquoi tu me le dis. Why do you tell me things I don't want to hear? But she was...
you needed to hear.
Yes, I needed to hear. But she was a major force. And it is true that we were fortunate, after a number of years of very hard work, we had a gender parity government. And one day in my memoirs, and I'll write my memoirs, I will write specifically about the difference of working with women and men, because there is a real difference. But we'll keep that for another day. Today, the issue we're going to talk about is trade. And let me just start by saying that in the case of Canada, this has a very special significance. We are a country of only 36 million people. And we live next to the most important superpower in the world, and we're fortunate in that regard. We're friends and allies of our American neighbors. But we in Canada are very trade dependent. We have the standard of living we have today because we have access to markets. And the issue for Canada, though, is that we lack diversity in our markets. We're much too dependent on our American neighbor. So as Monique mentioned a little earlier, we initiated with Europe this Canada-Europe trade agreement in 2007 when we launched the negotiations, and there was an alignment on our objectives, by the way. It wasn't as though there wasn't. We officially said we think this will take 2 years, and we thought it'll take 4. In fact, it took 10 years, because one of the unwritten rules of trade negotiations, if you know something about them, they're like house renovations. And if you've been through house renovations recently, you'll know what I'm talking about. It's rarely on budget, rarely on time, and if you're still with your partner at the end of it, it's a good sign. So it was a huge challenge for us to do this, especially given the size. But why did we do this? We did it because we felt it was very important to diversify. This also speaks to one key issue about trade. The trade story in the world is very significant in the last 20 years. From 1987 to 2007, trade growth in the world has been double the rate of GDP growth in the world. It has been the locomotive of prosperity. It has allowed hundreds of millions of people, including women, to be pulled out of prosperity, especially in emerging economies, in Asia in particular, China even more so. So the story on trade, for those of us who believe in it, is a very positive story. But one of the challenges and one of the things that has evolved on the trade narrative in the last 20, 30 years is that it used to be that trade negotiations were about the numbers, were about tariffs, were about norms, were about access and procurement. And now more and more countries are saying we want it to be about the environment, we want it to include culture, and yes, it should include the issue of gender and the impact it has on women, but not only women, on indigenous people and on our populations. And that's where the concept of inclusive trade has emerged. Canada and this new government, by the way, is very much on the leading edge of that, with mixed results. It's not, it is not given that if you go to China and say, I want this on the agenda, I want workers' rights, I want this on the agenda, that they're going to say yes, and that they're on the same wavelength. But there is a number of like-minded countries who recognize that as we push ahead with trade initiatives in the years to come, that it has to be much more than about the numbers and the impact. It has to be about the broader story of how do we make sure the benefits of trade actually are shared by a larger number of people in the world, including and specifically women.
Okay,
so that'll be our challenge as we look ahead.
Thank you, Monsieur le Premier Ministre. I have to stop him. Gloria, we'll come back with questions, Jean, afterwards, okay? We have a 20-minute question afterwards. Gloria, you're the CEO of the World Travel and Tourism Council. You were part of government of Mr. Calderon, and you've been Secretary of Tourism. Tourism is very important. It constitutes, I think, more than 300 million jobs. I think you mentioned that earlier. It's 10% of the GDP. 50% are women. Tell me, what is the impact of protectionism in tourism and specifically in jobs for women?
Well, first of all, thank you for the invitation. Glad to be here in this important forum. As you mentioned, travel and tourism, WTTC, for the ones that are not familiar, there are two organizations in the world. UNWTO represents the governments, WTTC, we represent the private sector. We do a lot of research. 185 countries, we quantify the economic impact and the contribution of travel and tourism. That's why we know about this 10.4% of the global GDP and 313 million jobs. Now, to answer to your question, let me give you a perspective. Last year, while the economy in the world grew 3% in average, travel and tourism grew 4.6%, the GDP for travel and tourism, which is 50% more. At the same time, from all the jobs that were created last year, 1 of every 5 were related to travel and tourism. So it brings a lot of opportunities, and the fact that 50% of the 313 million are women, I think that's very relevant. We have seen in countries where they have established policies for protectionism an impact in jobs, an impact in inbound, international people traveling to those countries, and also the opposite. When you look around, for instance, in economies just very close in Latin America, the example of Venezuela, what's going on with those protectionism, of course, tourism is really bad. And that's why when we look at Latin America, was the worst performing region in the world, -5%. Brazil was also impacted. And then we look at, for instance, Argentina, where in the past was very protectionist, lost a lot of jobs. Now, the good news is that with the new government, they are opening up. They are more favored to trade, which is great, and they are creating jobs. And for instance, I was there a couple of weeks ago, and in Argentina, we were able to see that their GDP for tourism grew also 4.8%. So whenever we see protectionism, we see an impact in jobs, we see an impact in trade, and we see an impact in the economy. So travel and tourism, at the end of the day, brings opportunities to a lot of women in not only developing countries, but also developed countries. If you don't allow that movement of people, if you don't allow that trade, if you implement policies that pretty much block that travel and tourism to your country and within your country, then you're not going to capitalize on those opportunities. And it is very important to understand that 47% of the jobs that we know today, they might not exist in 10 or 20 years. Those jobs are going to be either automated or are going to disappear. So the question is, for the future jobs, are we going to be able to create those jobs? If we have those type of policies, that's what we need to start having those conversations, and that's what I'm glad that we're part of this panel.
Okay, just quickly, you were part of the T20, yes. T for tourism,
yes, yes.
And therefore you were involved in a way in the G20. Tell me something, when you participate at this T20, what impact did you have on the G20, afterwards?
I had the opportunity to be part of the cabinet for President Calderon, as you mentioned, as the Minister of Tourism for Mexico, a country that depends on tourism 16% of the total GDP, considering direct and indirect, and employs more than 8 million people. 2012, Mexico was the chair for the G20, and I hosted the T20. One thing that I learned, and perhaps here you are going to disagree with me a little bit, is that a lot of times in governments, we talk a lot. We talk, and we have these long agendas, but then no action, unfortunately. I came from the private sector. I was invited to the government. So for that meeting specifically, we only have one topic, one single topic. How do we create jobs? And that was to the travel facilitation, to support travel facilitation, the opening. And the good news is that we were able to include in the G20 Leaders Declaration in Los Cabos, not only the importance of travel and tourism, but also the support in that movement of people and travel facilitation. That was possible in 2012, and last month we also had the T20 in Argentina, so hopefully they will replicate that this year.
Thank you very much. Karen, you're next. Karen has been involved in external affairs for all her life, I guess, more or less. And Karen is the ambassador of France in Canada, so we're very proud to have you. You've been there for 1 year. There are only 25% of posts that are held by women. So it's a very rare fact to have a woman ambassador in a very important post, I think. I regard it as, it's not Washington, but it's important. In light of CETA, what is your assessment of the links between trade and gender equality?
Well, I want to make a first point. I think there is a kind of paradox, because we know that protectionism is not good news for men and women, but especially for women, because being protectionist means that you stick to the statu quo, you avoid being challenged, and basically you refuse mutual gains from trade. So we know that it's good news, but on the other hand, we have no proof that having more international competition benefits to women as well, because we have no proof that it's going to diminish all the inequalities. And as you know, very often women work in poor and unqualified jobs, local markets, agriculture sectors, and they don't gain the benefits of, all these international trade. They have no access to the digital economy. They struggle to have access to finance. So we don't know if actual trade is good or is not good for women, even if you have proven that we have some figures that prove the contrary. So we have to be very vigilant when we are negotiating a trade agreement. And it's true that for years, we never took into account this gender dimension. And we are starting to do that. So we've been talking a lot about CETA. So your minister here, Mr. Champagne, describes it as a golden agreement, but maybe not so gold. I mean, in terms of women, the word women is used only 6 times in an agreement which contains 1,600 pages. But still, there are some dispositions who can have some positive effects on women. For example, the EU member states and Canada commit in this agreement to reinforce all the convention in the field of the ILO, the International Labour Organizations, which means that we will have to fight discrimination, we will have to fight discrimination, union discrimination, because as you know, in unions, you have very little women involved in negotiation in the workplaces. So it's a good start. And the CETA also involves civil society. And of course, by involving civil society, I think that the gender dimension will be much more addressed.
We'll come back, Julien, later on about the fact that you said the word woman is mentioned 6 times. We'll talk about, in the second part, about leadership. How do we change that? Julie Lynn Teiglen, she has a big job at Ernst & Young. She's the managing director for Ernst & Young in Switzerland, Austria, and Germany. And if you look at her name, and you'll find that she's also been quite involved in the G20. She was involved in the W20. And she has a lot because you were then with Christine Lagarde and Madame Merkel and these women, and you were playing the role that I played today. Perhaps you could tell us about your experience, Julie.
That sounds perfect. Maybe I'll start with just a brief introduction as to what the connection is between those activities and what I do daily, and then I'd like to come back and comment a little bit on some of my predecessors' comments and provide some perspective. I probably have a little bit of unusual background, Monique, you know this. I have Canadian parents and grandparents and a family, so a long history here. Was actually born in the US as a first-generation American, but spent the last 30 plus years in Europe. And in Europe, I work for a tremendous organization with EY. I'm very proud of that because our organization has a very clear purpose around building a better working world. And as part of that, we've said gender diversity is one of the elements that we'd like to stand for. In that time, we've gone to Davos the last 4 years and made very clear statements with very visible activities, including, for an example, an ice block, showing that it would then take us over 80 years to reach gender equality. I'm really embarrassed, frankly, to sit together with everyone and say that now it's actually 117 years, and it keeps getting worse. And so the activities that we have started with our organization has been trying to fight for more gender equality as a way to demonstrate that that brings economic growth through further participation in economic activities. And we've formed organizations, for example, Women in the Power of Three, bringing together government, business, and boards to really put into action activities that are out there. And those organizations run in over 20 countries across the globe. Our Women Fast Forward has millions of followers, and we've really tried to promote that. I think all of those activities are great, and I'm a big supporter and obviously involved myself in those. The beginning of the establishment of the W20 in Turkey, moving that to China, had a big impact working with great colleagues across Germany, and now it's coming to Argentina. And still, we've moved back 147 years. I have 4 children. My oldest child is a daughter. I have 3 boys. I really want them to grow up in a world that says everything is possible. And when I read the newspaper every day, and now I'll get the curve back to my comments, when I read the newspaper every day, I can tell you all that I am terrified. And I'm terrified because I live right now and have lived the past 30 years in the European Union, probably one of the world's biggest experiments towards free trade. 500 million consumers coming together to share 4 things, 4 freedoms: the freedom of goods, services, workforce, and capital. And in fact, that experiment was designed to promote growth and prosperity. It was designed to promote political stability. We have to remember, coming off the back of certain conflicts across Europe that aren't that long ago. And it actually was designed to promote integration, which until recently, actually, you could say that experiment didn't go so badly. In fact, when we look at the statistics, the European Union projects that 90% of its growth over the next 10 years, 90% will come from export. And export represents over 31 million jobs. So I'll come back to exactly your comment. 31 million jobs. So remember the 4 things, right? Integration, political stability, growth, prosperity. Did we mention anything about the inequalities in a country, about wealth? No. Did we say anything about a fear of the megatrends that are coming with all of us, with digitalization and the changes of jobs? No. And so when we look upon that, I kind of think that free trade, which has given us so much over the last years, is frankly being abused by comments today that are everywhere around protectionism. And protectionism, we know for a fact, does 2 things. It increases prices by lowering competition, and it lowers purchasing power. That's a fact. That's demonstrated time and time again. Who is that good for? It can only be good for the very, very rich. And when I talk about who it's good for, the very, very richest of countries and the very, very richest within those. It can never be good for anyone that has a large percentage of GDP based on consumption. And frankly, those are the poorest, and within those, most of the women.
I'd like to perhaps to interrupt now, and you mentioned that in the CETA 6 times we read the word woman. I was under the impression there was a chapter on women. Isn't there in the agreement? Separate from the agreement, but isn't there a chapter?
No, there is a chapter in the agreement between Canada and Chile, and that the first time that this kind of agreement exists. And I think it's a very, very good practice.
Okay.
But not in the CETA, but remember the CETA took 10 years to be negotiated. So 10 years ago, we were not aware of, gender, climate change, and so that's some parts are missing in the agreement.
And you're right, absolutely, Ambassador. Canada, Chile innovates in that regard, but also the WTO has a working group on this issue, which is also relatively new. So, it is important to look at how the trend line on trade has evolved. It used to be sacred, and the trade negotiators would never want anyone to interrupt their negotiations with side issues by fear that it would derail the negotiations. That has changed. For example, when we did CETA, Canada insisted that culture be part of it. And one of the reasons why we insisted was we have fought very hard in the FTA with the United States, in NAFTA, to protect culture because our American neighbor is so overwhelming in that regard. And so we are now moving into a new world where these issues are going to be on the agenda. But be careful of what that means. It does not mean trade agreements do not fix domestic issues, which I think you're leading to. Trade agreements do not force governments to deal with inequalities within their own jurisdiction. It doesn't fix the issue of education of young women, for example. Those are domestic governments. What it can do is put a spotlight on it and say, as you measure the output and the outcomes of a trade agreement, we want to know what the impact will be on women. It can do that. But be careful. I mean, not to create an expectation that the trade agreement is going to fix something, that it falls within the responsibility of sovereign governments as opposed to the responsibility of someone else.
But if I may, don't take me wrong, I mean, the CETA is a very ambitious agreement, very comprehensive, because it tackles with lots of issues that were not before. So maybe not specifically on women, but by dealing with social norms, environmental norms, and everything, that would benefit women, of course.
Okay, but we know one thing, that power is of the essence if we want things to change. Monsieur Charest, you mentioned the WTO, the Declaration on Trade, Women Economic Empowerment.
Yep.
Well, one has to question, where's the beef? Because, you know, on the ministerial conference, 10 chairs to women. General Council, 22 chairs to women. Dispute settlement, 23 chairs to women. Committee for Trade and Services, 24 chairs for women. Where's the beef? How do we make sure that when we address something like that, like you did, Monsieur le Premier Ministre, you decided that we would have 50% of women in cabinet, you did it. You decided on board there should be 50% of women, you did it. So how, I'd like to know from you whether it's dreaming in color or whether it's realistic to think that we are going to occupy at least 40% of those important jobs.
Well, these issues are leadership driven. And, you know, in the end, leadership by men and women and organizations. In other words, changes will not happen unless someone at the top decides and makes it an issue. And in our experience, Monique, you'll remember, we had gender parity in our government. We started in 2003, we did not have it. It happened in 2007. It happened over a period of time because when I was leader of the party, I made sure, and it was a very clear objective of mine and of our group, that we have women who could get elected in ridings where they would be successful. But it took us 4 years, and much more than that, the opposition took us about 10, 14 years to get to where we were. I mean, parity didn't happen because we decided it would be parity. We had to work to getting there, which is a word of caution to those who are there now. The biggest mistake folks could make is say, we have parity now, so let's go home and forget about it. It is a constant work, and it's the same thing in these international organizations. On the parity of boards, you were in cabinet with me, we kept asking for women candidates, and they kept coming back to us saying, well, there are none. You know, we looked, there are none, so we said, fine, we'll pass a law. And when the law was passed, all of a sudden, all these women who did not exist, they appeared. They were hiding. We understood. They were hiding from us. And but it only happened at that condition. And on the trade file, it's an interesting story because it's a moving story. The narrative of it changes. But I guess the word of caution that I'm saying is no one should think that leaders are off the hook because there's a trade agreement. We should hook them onto this and say, listen, we're going to shine a light on the outcomes of trade agreements and measure the impact it will have on women, and we expect you to respond to that.
Right, I couldn't agree more. I think also that is very important that we have seen is, at least from the private sector perspective, what we're doing in counterterrorism is making sure that the good cases are put on the spot and acknowledging those. And that's not because you're here, and of course we're in Canada, but Canada is a great model and a great example that we need to look more for instance, I'm Mexican, and I know that a lot of Mexicans travel and spend a lot of money when they travel shopping and multiple activities. And we have seen an increase of Mexicans coming to Canada. And it's not only because of the policies that have been implemented here, it's a combination of factors. So they're doing some things pretty right here that we need to make sure we document and we share those practices with other countries.
I'd like to mention something. You'll have a chance probably to come in there. When I read about the G20 or the W20, to sort of get the attention to change things, they talk at one point of gender bilingualism leaders. That is, meaning you need to get men to embark in the process. You need to get men to agree that it is a priority. How could we do something about that? How could we, perhaps Karen, do you have suggestions about that?
Yeah, I think that, acting and advocating for gender balance, it's not just concerning women, it's just for the sake of the society. So if you can prove that by having a more balanced society, having more women in decision-making boards or companies or negotiation teams, then the world will be better. So we have figures to document that, but on a more practically based, for example, within my ministry at the Foreign Service, we have an association which is called Femmes et Diplomatie. And we have been trying to find solutions because as a diplomat, it's very difficult if you want to have a personal life, a family life. You go abroad like every 3 years. So how do you combine your private life and your business life? And we have been trying to find out some solutions. And finally, we discovered that the solution that we were looking for and that we invented were beneficial for men as well, because everybody has a family life. So I think it's by providing tools and good practice and not trying to divide the world in two, men and women, but trying to persuade everyone that we will all benefit from a more comprehensive society, then we will make it.
The reason why it was mentioned also at that meeting, gender fatigue, that is sometimes people say, oh, not again, that we need to change the conversation. This is why gender bilingualism, I understand, struck some kind of chord. Am I right?
Very much so. I think it has to be, and that goes back to the reasons that protectionism are increasing in terms of the fear and the inequalities that we're seeing in many societies. Those inequalities are only deepened if it's a them and an us. It needs to be all of us together in the same boat. And I think some of the things that we're striving for, economic equality, benefit both sides. It's not just a gender issue, which is why I think it's great, Monique, that we're talking on this panel about free trade, which is, yes, it has an impact, as does everything on gender issues, but it's an overall issue for our society that we need to address. It's hurting all of us economically, and I think that's something we can't forget.
By the way, I just want to say something. Diversity does not apply to women. We're 50% of the people, okay? So we're not diverse. Jean, did you want to comment?
Well, I think the key word is fairness. You know, from where I sat, the situation we faced was just unfair to women. Set aside the concept of feminism for a while. Why would we exclude, because that's the effect of the policies, a whole number of people who, justifiably so, should be able to contribute? Now, but there's two levels. You know, there's one level there's a level of the leader who says, you know, and when I say the leader in the organization that says, this is an issue and we need to change it, and here's what we need to do to change it, and change it in a real way. But then you have to create the conditions that allow women to participate. And that's a much tougher Now, together when we were in Quebec, one of the things, and I think Jerry Dias mentioned it earlier today in another panel, we put together a very forward-looking daycare policy, universal daycare, very low price, 10 hours a day. Quebec had one of the lowest participation rates of women in the labor market in Canada. And we have an aging population. And we need, and immigration alone is not going to solve the problem. By the way, Gloria, we get a lot of Mexicans who come, who are manual laborers who work in Canada every year. And Canada, contrary to our neighbor, we'd like to keep a lot of them, but they go home in November for reasons that escape us. I don't know what, and then we follow them in January and February. We go see where they are and say, hey, come back in the summer. But immigration alone doesn't solve it. So ladies and gentlemen, and this is true in Europe, it's true in a lot of developed countries, aging population, and yet we have all these women for whom the conditions are not set so that they may choose. And I'm here again, the word's important. We're not coercing anyone. The conditions have to be that allow them to choose to come into the labor market. Well, Quebec went from the lowest rate within all provinces to the third highest rate in the world of participation of women in the labor market. But this program, and I initially was very reticent about it, and so were you, by the way.
No. Yes,
you were.
No.
It's going to be in my memoirs. Read it,
No,
folks.
no. It's all wrong. Your memoir
Because
is wrong.
it costs a lot of money. But you know what? The birth rate went up. Women are in the labor market. Poverty went down. And we can better educate our children. So sometimes those choices...
We have the last 10 minutes, and I'd like us to address in the last 10 minutes recommendations that we want to make. Why is it, can we do something? The fact that the agreement with Chile, there was a chapter for women. Outside the agreement, I'm told, but at least there was something. It didn't happen in CETA. What is the recommendation we want to give to the G7 that will happen in the next few weeks in La Malbaie? Do we want, how do we do that? How do we influence these men, mostly, not all, but mostly, but we don't mind, provided they care and they want to change things?
Well, I think the G7 is a good example, but the Canadian G7 presidency is very, very strong on gender, because gender is a theme horizontal. So on all the subjects, we will address the gender issue. And I think it's the first presidency of the G7 who did that ever in the past. So it's really, really inspiring, and we will hold the French presidency after you Canadian, and we will continue to build on that because it's really inspiring. But to be sure that it will be continued, let's have women as negotiators. Let's have women in key positions, and we haven't spoken about quotas, but I know it's against Canadian state of mind because you are more on consensus.
I'm for quotas.
But let's
Totally.
stay close and let's decide that yes, we will have more women and we will have laws and they will be implemented.
Could we make a recommendation? I think you mentioned that, Karen, that a legally binding commitment to equality. Could we do that? Could we achieve something like that? What do you think? We'll ask the men.
I think that let's try to look at what is doable and we can do fast that will advance the ball. If I had one thing I'm thinking would be very efficient, is to say every time we do a trade agreement, we should measure the outcome and consequences for women. And if you did that and say we are all committed to doing that, you know, I'm a big believer in information and sharing it and transparency, because it's the first thing that has an impact on the development of public policy. And if they made that commitment, that would be a major advancement.
I think that I would build on that. I'd love to see that as a commitment, because I think it would reinforce the need to drive free trade, reinforce the need that drives growth and prosperity, and then use it to shine the light on the gender aspect around economic empowerment. It would hit two birds with one stone, and a little bit, when we counteract what we're currently reading each and every day in the press around protectionism and measures across the globe. That would be a fantastic, doable statement.
I'm sorry, because they will follow the impact of the trade agreement on poverty, for instance, that women are not as poor as they were. I'm interested as well, if it's at all possible, to have some impact on the leadership of the people who are involved. Now, of course, we don't want to replace, they're elected, but they form committees, they form subcommittees. Could we ask for something at the G7 and say, make sure that you have 30% of women chair of committees chaired by women? They may just say no. You know, there's no risk. I mean, we're not going to die if they say no. We're used to that.
I would say, if I may, it would be helpful, and I couldn't agree more with measurement. To have, and I don't know what is that answer, but to have one recommendation, just one that we can quantify, that we can measure, we can monitor, and we can track, and we can see that outcome. If we go and ask for 5 or 6 things, most likely we're not going to get any, right? But if we ask for one, that you can make an impact, either have some women, some sort of representation, or have 50% of cabinet, I don't know what is that. I have no clue what is it that, what will be the best. But my recommendation, based on my experience in government, the private sector, will be try to get one, quantify, measure the impact, monitor so that we can track the progress.
Do you agree with that?
Totally.
Totally.
Agree. Less is more.
And you know the advantage of that? Very difficult for them to say no. Huh? You know, give them a recommendation they can't say no to.
Okay, so we would have one recommendation in terms of protectionism. That is, their report card should be involved, not just on poverty, but on the number of women who occupy senior jobs at the decision-making level. We could include that?
You can make it very specific, yes. But I would say we need to make sure that we can quantify that impact. Because if we just say, let's have this, and then you are not able to quantify the impact, it's going to be very hard to track. So we say, let's have one recommendation. I don't know if we have the answer right now. I think that that's something that can be included. I just say you have some certain women leading the efforts, but have one that we can quantify.
Okay.
And measure that in different
That
ways.
was one of the recommendations you gave me, Karen.
I think it would be a very powerful message because we never did that at the G7. So having the proof that the head of states are committed to have a very high target, that would be great. But if we can implement what we say we will do, that would be better.
I feel very bad because I said at the beginning that if you had questions, you could go and ask questions. There's 2 minutes left. People had a lot to say. Is there something else you'd like to add to this panel? We know we have one recommendation, a report card, sort of. We have a technician here, a technical. We want to recommend a report card, not only on the level of poverty, but in terms of powerful jobs that people have. And that would be it in terms of our recommendation for the G8. It doesn't look poor to you?
No, it doesn't. I think if we make it very substantial and very real, and if it's in relation to trade, then it's significant. And there's a good alignment here. We have a Prime Minister in Canada who cares very sincerely about this issue, followed by the President of France, President Macron, who also cares about this issue and has been both of them have been very upfront on this. So this is an opportunity that isn't going to come around very often to have 2 successive G7s where this issue will be prominent. And the Women's Forum will happen in November in Paris, by the way, and that will be an opportunity to reinforce the message again for President Macron before he takes it over in 2019.
In fact, France is practically a model in terms of quotas because if there's one, many countries are now involved, but in terms of board composition, you move from, I think, 12 or 13% to now over 40% of women on boards. So it really changed a lot in France. So I'm sad that in Canada we're not taking a stronger stand about that. Okay, so listen, I'll finish with a quote from Guterres, who's the DG at the UN. Gender parity is an urgent need and a personal priority. It's a moral duty and an operational necessity. The meaningful inclusion of women in decision-making increases effectiveness and productivity, brings new perspectives and solutions to the table, unlocks greater resources, and strengthens efforts across all of our work. So at least there is one big important leader who's made it a personal commitment. I want to thank our panel. Thank you very much, Monsieur. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, all of you.